June 8, 1783, George Washington sent a letter to all the governors of the states announcing his retirement from the leadership of the United States Army. They had just won the American Revolution. Washington used what he thought as his last opportunity to release an official statement to include some of his ideas about how the newly independent nation should work. Although widely reprinted and being Washington's longest public message of the war, this circular letter had little impact, with some believing Washington had overstepped his boundaries. The first thing Washington wrote was that he was preparing to resign from public office. However, early in the document, Washington wrote, "The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and clearly defined than at any former period. The researches of the human mind after social happiness have been carried to a great extent. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, and legislators through a long succession of years are laid open for our use, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our forms of government." In this passage, Washington reminisced about the base of the United States as being a strong foundation of rights. The gloomy age of ignorance and superstition refers to a time when the lack of rights, like religious freedom, and other confusion oppressed the Western world. Such a related event in context could be the Salem witch trials, where superstition led to the conviction of many women as witches. A more recent contextual event could be the Newburgh Conspiracy, where Washington's leading officers were going to discuss a fiery petition calling for mutiny if Congress didn't give them back pay and pensions. When Washington wrote philosophers, that may refer to John Locke. Locke is known as the intellectual father of the country because he wrote about the natural rights of man, providing the basis for the major ideas of the U.S. government. In this excerpt, a piece of subtext is that Washington may be referring to salutary neglect before the French and Indian War, and how it allowed self-government to reform in America. Washington's goal with this statement may have been to make the people of America reflect on all the years and effort it took for the United States to become an independent nation. In this respect, Washington doesn't just address the governors of each state, or even just Congress. He addressed every single person in the country in order to remind them of the Republican virtues they need to maintain for the efforts of the Revolutionary War to remain successful. On the system of government at the time, Washington wrote, "For according to the system of policy of the states shall adopt at this moment, they will stand or fall, and by their confirmation or lapse, it is yet to be decided whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse. A blessing or a curse, not to the pleasant age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved." This statement means that Washington doesn't know whether the results of the revolution will prove to be beneficial or harmful towards Americans then and in future generations. When Washington wrote the system of policy of the states, he is referring to the Articles of Confederation, the system of government at the time. Although Washington was retired, he would soon realize that the nation was not functioning well under the Articles and would step back into the public eye. Another piece of context for Washington's statement is the huge amounts of debt the Confederation Congress and the state governments have acquired in financing the war. If the new nation cannot find a way to pay off the debt, the revolution may ultimately prove to be a curse. When Washington referenced unborn millions, it is consistent with the trend of how Washington always acted, knowing that the times were of incredible historical importance. This viewpoint likely influenced Washington's actions, possibly accounting for why he retired in 1783 and why he returned to leadership in 1787 as president of the convention, and also in 1789, unanimously being elected as president of the United States. A piece of subtext in this excerpt is that Washington may already know how flawed the Articles of Confederation are, and he may be worried for the sake of future generations. Also, Washington may have the intent to warn the Confederation Congress and the state governors that the Articles will not be able to stand a test of time and must be revised. This could explain why Washington was appointed president of the convention and so easily accepted leaving his retirement for the position. Washington's tone in this excerpt appears to be somewhat ominous. Perhaps he wanted to be clear about the enormous gravity of the decisions made, as to continue his significant influence over the people of America. Near the end of the letter, Washington wrote that the inefficiency of measures arising from the want of an adequate authority in the supreme power, from a partial compliance with the requisitions of Congress in some of the states, and from a failure of punctuality in others, while it tended to damp the zeal of those which were more willing to exert themselves, served also to accumulate the expenses of the war and to frustrate the best concerted plans, and that the discouragement occasioned by the complicated difficulties and embarrassments in which our affairs were by this means involved, and would have long ago produced the dissolution of any army, less patient, less virtuous, and less persevering than that which I have had the honor to command. In this excerpt, Washington complained about the inefficiency of the Confederation Congress to acquire soldiers for the Continental Army, and to find the funds to pay those soldiers. He also wrote about how these complications could have made the soldiers even less virtuous, causing possible harm to the army. A major piece of context in this statement is how the Confederation Congress was considering shorting the soldiers' payment in order to decrease debt. The Congress also struggled to find funds for provisions and weapons for the army, causing problems for the continuation of the war at times. Also, the Newburgh Conspiracy plays a major role in the context of this excerpt. The questions about shorting the army members' pensions led to talk about possible mutiny among the leading officers. Washington delicately handled the situation, imposing guilt upon his officers from all the sacrifices he had made for them and for the entire army. In this excerpt, Washington continues this trend, reestablishing the sacrifices he has made for the army he had the honor to command. Another piece of context is the Battle of Yorktown that culminated the Revolution and led to the defeat of Cornwallis's army. Congress was struggling to finance the war and could not pay for American forces to go to Yorktown to end the war. Robert Morris, known as the financier of the Revolution, established the Bank of North America, and he was able to finance Washington and Rochambeau's campaign to Yorktown. A piece of subtext relating to this excerpt is that Washington's intent was to convince the Congress to continue financing the war, so that events like the Newburgh Conspiracy would never occur again. Also, Washington may intend to be invested in the payment of debts. As a result, he would benefit financially if the soldiers were paid the promised amounts. This may relate to why Washington greatly supported Hamilton's financial plan years later. The intended audience of this excerpt is the Confederation Congress, in order to urge the delegates to pay the soldiers and maintain their promised pensions. Another intended audience could be Washington's leading officers, as a reminder of the Newburgh Conspiracy, in order to remind them to never again consider mutiny. The final thought Washington wrote was, "And finally, that he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all, to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion, and without an humble imitation, of whose example in these things we can never hope to be a happy nation." In this excerpt, Washington addressed his religion and God in order to hope to be a happy nation. This means that Washington thought religion was necessary to fully embrace success in the new United States. In context, Washington was involved with the Anglican Church his entire life and promoted the right of all Americans to freedom of religion. Also, Washington referred to revolutionary republicanism and the public virtues with charity, humility, and the pacific temper of mind. These virtues, according to Washington, would lead to the success of the nation. Another piece of context are the contradictions about Washington's religious life. He was said to be a very private man in terms of religion, yet he displayed his beliefs very clearly at the end of his letter sent to the governors of each state. A piece of subtext in this excerpt is that Washington's intent was to make the people of America believe that practicing religion and following the public virtues were the keys to the success of the nation. Washington's tone in this section seems optimistic, but also somewhat threatening because he says that God would be pleased to dispose of anyone who doesn't follow the public virtues. In a way, Washington's intent is to spread his religious beliefs, conflicting with the supposed privacy of his religious life. The intended audience in this excerpt seems to be all Americans, because Washington means to have all Americans believe in revolutionary republicanism and follow the public virtues. By sending this letter to the governors of each state, Washington was not only addressing the state governments, but also the Confederation Congress, his Continental Army, and everyone living in the United States. Although this document was widely reproduced and contained much of Washington's political ideology, or lack thereof, it had little impact overall. For Washington, at this moment in history, it made sense to retire. He had just won a war for the United States, his reputation was at stake. He cared little for power, and he was happiest spending time at his home, Mount Vernon, with his family. Retirement made sense in 1783, and he would remain in such a state until 1787, when the country would call upon him, this time to lead as President of the Constitutional Convention